Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I'm not used to seeing the COVID seating. It's a little bit daunting, but thank you all for coming out on this rainy night. We have two very distinguished guests for this Tuesday evening. Sean Scully, who most of you know is one of the most important artists in our collection, and certainly one of the most important artists working today. We acquired our first work by Sean in 1988, the great Pale Fire painting, which is hanging upstairs, and we have continued to acquire work over the years, including his Catherine series, which we were able to acquire through his generosity and the Burnett Foundation in 2002. This is the third exhibition in the last 28 years, I think, that we have presented of Sean's work, and it is organized by the Philadelphia Museum and Timothy Rubb, its director, who is here with us tonight. It's a wonderful show, and most importantly, it's a real retrospective, beginning with Sean's early work. I've worked with him for many years, and some of the early work I had not seen. It was just thrilling to see it in the galleries. Timothy has done a wonderful job with a beautiful selection. Catalog is marvelous, very insightful essay. And he and Sean are going to have a conversation with us tonight, talking about ideas, Sean's work, and anything else they want to talk about. So please welcome Sean and Timothy Rubb.
How does that sound up there? Good. Now we'll get Sean wired up and we'll be ready to go. And while he's working on that, I'll filibuster a bit. Okay? And thank you, Marla, for that lovely introduction. When somebody introduces us as distinguished guests, that's a warning not to misbehave. I don't need that warning, but Sean does, so. And so again, I want to thank Marla for her introduction, for presenting the exhibition here. And we are delighted, and really very much delighted to work in partnership with her and her staff. This show was originally scheduled to open in Philadelphia in May of 2020, so just about 18 months or so ago. During Sean's 75th year. But the pandemic scuttled those plans and forced us to rearrange the tour. So it will now open in Philadelphia next April, and it's a real pleasure for me to be able to see it before the fact and begin to imagine what it will look like in our exhibition spaces, which are different than yours. Not as big, not as grand, in some ways not as beautiful. I'm very envious of this building and what you have here. Just by way of introduction, the title of the show, Sean Scully, The Shape of Ideas, was drawn from an observation made by the Irish writer Samuel Beckett, who was speaking about one of the early fathers of the church, St. Augustine, and a particular turn of phrase that he used in describing a biblical scene, and he said it is the shape that matters, and what he meant by that was the idea mattered a great deal, but the form it took was equally important, and it was what caught our attention, and in turn shaped our perception of the content. And I really think that's the real question, the question to ask of abstraction. How do we invest it with meaning? What elevates it beyond pattern or decoration or merely formal invention? Certainly that was the goal that motivated the pioneers of abstraction, Kandinsky, Mondrian, Malevich, in the early decades of the 20th century. And I think it is clearly central to understanding Sean Scully's work as well. And I hope we'll get into that as we go on in the evening. The artist has not been the subject of a comprehensive retrospective in this country, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, since the mid-1990s at the Hirshhorn, which was really a mid-career show. In fact, it would be fair to say that his work has not been exhibited more widely or it has been exhibited more widely and more comprehensively abroad, particularly in Europe and more specifically in Germany. And since then, and so in this regard, the show is not only timely, but also long overdue to give American audiences a look at the shape of his work across what is now 5 decades. And the exhibition attempts to do that as best it can, both in its, and to really take the measure of his achievement, both in scope and depth, and as well as the arc of his development, which has been unceasing and might be characterized as both patient and methodical. Scully has called himself a bricklayer, not simply because he employs rectangular blocks of color in his work or because of the importance he attaches to his craft, and I would encourage you to pay close attention to that question as you look at the pictures in the exhibition, but also because of his persistence in finding his way forward toward forms of expression that are not merely satisfying in formal terms, but are deeply invested with meaning, towards finding, to use Beckett's lovely phrase again, the shape that matters. And I think, again, this is what has driven him throughout or across his entire career. The exhibition takes us, and I guess we can go to the first slide here. Oh, I'm already past that. Here he is in greener days, around 1980 or so, 81?
Yeah, 81.
In his Duane Street studio in New York, with some familiar looking pictures behind him. And as I began to say, the exhibition takes us from here, Green Light, which is a picture from the early 1970s when he was still in school in England. And I think actually you did this while you were on a fellowship here at Harvard.
Yeah, it's done at Harvard.
Yeah, and to here, which is one of the last pictures in the show dating to 2017, and lots of stops along the way. And just to finish my concluding remarks, I'll say it does not include any of the photographs that he has made from time to time, or examples of his growing interest in making sculpture, which has become very, very interesting, particularly over the past several years. Rather, it focuses on his work as a painter, a draftsman, and a printmaker, which I believe he considers, as I certainly do, all of a piece. He's also a prolific maker of things, and for this reason, although all retrospectives must be selective, this one seems especially so, especially given the serial nature of his work. And trust me when I say it could be quite twice as large and really not take the full measure of his achievement. But it is what we have here, and I think it gives you a good sense of where he's come from and where he's traveled. So let's begin, if we might, with this picture, which is actually from 1970, and one of the most extraordinary paintings of his early career, a painting called Backcloth, done in acrylic on canvas. And let me begin by asking Sean about choosing the stripe. You chose it early on as a visual motif with which you would build your paintings, inspired perhaps by the trip you took in the late 60s to Morocco and the textiles you saw there. So tell us about this picture and what you were trying to achieve with it at the time, particularly the use of the grid, but also to complicate the grid into something that was very difficult to read rationally, I would say.
Correct, yes. You know, I think that my mind is quite subversive, and that might be connected to coming from a small country, a small heavily colonized country. So the only way to survive that really in the thinking is to be subversive, because you cannot be obviously equal in muscle. And there seems to be something very deeply subversive in me. So what I've done here is taken the stripe, which I brought back from Morocco, frankly. Before I went to Morocco, I hadn't used it. And at this time, I was listening to, in Newcastle, which is the most northern town in the UK before you get to unconquerable Scotland. Even the Romans couldn't conquer Scotland. And the Roman boys used to hop over the wall and never come back. And you had this very strong sense of existential isolation up there, because it really was the last stop. And the studio that I had was a big studio, and it was the end of the building. So I really thought of myself being at the end of England. And I'm bringing with me all this heat from Morocco, because it's a very hot painting. And you know, you see abstract expressionism at the back. It started out very loose. And what I was listening to was the Velvet Underground.
Lou Reed.
And Nico, very importantly, Nico. And Bach, mostly. And of course I had Phil Spector on my mind. You know, I've always been very interested in music. And I was thinking about the wall of sound, and the wall of sound is made by layering, and that's how Phil Spector made those delicious records, you know, by the chiffons. Mm-hmm. And he layered the sounds, and he exemplified the marriage of beautiful harmonizing in Black American music with, you know, studio elaboration, you might say. So what I was trying to do here was make chaos out of order. And that's what you rightly described. You said it's not something you can decode. So I was making grids, and then I was making more grids, but they were measured off differently. So you'd have all these collisions and mismatches. So the whole thing became kind of crazy. So I turned order into disorder.
And you know, there's a temptation when you look at a picture like this to decode it in terms of its process. How was it made? Where did you start? What did you do next and after that? And of course, the longer you look at a picture like this, the more you feel defeated by the task. It's almost impossible to do. But you made a move in a very oddball picture a couple of years later that actually pulls back the curtain a bit on that very issue. And I think inadvertently, it's at the beginning, led to something much later in your work. And that's this work, which is called Inset number 2 from 1973. So in this painting, unless I'm mistaken, it's fair to say that the process by which it was made somewhat reveals itself.
Yeah, as you say, I pulled back the curtain. But I did it because I was, even then, somewhat alarmed by the direction in which abstraction had gone. That most abstract paintings seem to be all over, what they called all over. So it was all over, and it wasn't all over the place. It was just all over the canvas, and it was all over the same. So that seemed to me to be leading to a kind of defeatism. And I was thinking all the time about the duality of things. You know, I mean, I'm fundamentally European. I'm a European with an American passport. And that's different from an American with a European passport. I don't know how, because I haven't got one. But if you come to America, you are in a culture that values extreme directness and refinement, physical refinement in art, above the heavy physicality of, let's say, a lot of European painting, particularly painting from Italy and Germany. So I find myself rocking from one side to the other. I'm very direct, but at the same time, my paintings are always dialectical in some way. And that's what this is. This is asking you to look at two things at once instead of one thing at once. And I preserved the beginning of the painting by covering it and then gridding up the rest. Now, this obviously dialogues a little bit with other things that were going on at the time. There was a guy who put some masking tape down on the floor in a gallery. And then 6 months later, he took it up. And guess what?
He had a picture.
The part where the masking tape was cleaner than the rest. Just fancy. Imagine such a thing. Because people were walking around on the floor and they were making the painting. So there was a lot of process art in the air, a lot of conceptual art, where there wasn't so much physical commitment, but there was a lot of mental rumination going on, strategizing. So this had something to do with that. I mean, there's a connection there. But of course, I'm always in love with painting, always in love with the world of visual enrichment and the mystery of that. Because even so, I do something that's very clear. It's still inscrutable, right? I mean, it still maintains its mystery.
These pictures were also enormously popular when you first showed them, yes?
Yeah, hugely.
And your first show would be by any measure. This is the one in London in 1973.
Yeah.
At the Rowan Gallery, by any measure, would have been considered a success.
Yeah, it was hugely successful.
So then you turned around and you didn't continue in this direction. You really set off in not the opposite direction, but you did something entirely different. And here's the beginning of that, I think, of a process that led you down a different path, eventually to New York the following year in 1975, to the making of pictures that are radically different than where you had been a few years before. And this has always seemed to me to be one of those pivots in your career when you made this picture. Now, it has a lot to do, if I understand the process of its making, with the pictures you did before, but it is absolutely spare by comparison. So could you talk a bit about how you made this and what you were thinking at the time?
Yeah, well, what I was thinking was that when I made illusionistic paintings, I was trying to give something in the paintings that compensated in some way for the lack of the figure or the lack of the face. Because I, as you know, was a portraitist early on. And I converted to abstraction. So when I converted to abstraction, I always lamented the loss of the figure. And of course, figuration has returned in a spectacular manner. So what I did with this was to lay out in a single line 9 paintings, and then I did procedural things on them, and then I put them in a square, which gave me that result. So there's a lot of conceptualizing in it, a lot of process making. The paintings I was making back then were very influenced by the Gestalt under which I was working. And that was a time when painting was severely under threat. Certainly abstract painting was considered to be passé because people were doing things on the earth or with performances, early videos that were process-oriented, conceptual strategies that led to a result that you would accept because of the integrity of the process. Mm-hmm. So there was a moralizing, puritanical, cleansing, moralizing ethic at work, heavily at work in the 70s, which followed, of course, the 60s, as these things do. The excesses of the 60s were followed by the buttoned-up repression of the 70s, and also by an incredible economic hangover. In the UK, for example, couldn't happen in America because the National Guard would just shoot them. But in the UK, the unions actually wanted to bring down the government and bankrupt the UK to turn it into a socialist country. And 2,000 businesses per day were closing. And these guys would say, look, I just can't give you any more. And they would say, oh, yeah, well, you've got this and you've got that, and we've only got our underpants. And they go on strike, business would go down, 2,000 a day. So this is the atmosphere under which I was making these very stringent, quite moralizing paintings.
And the next step was to go even further in that direction.
Correct.
So let's move on to this picture. Also in the exhibition, you have to go around the corner from the main galleries to take a look at this, but I encourage you to do so. It's one of 2 works on paper from a series of 51 that you did in the summer of 1975. So a couple of years, or a year or so after the picture I just showed you on the screen. And I think it reflects again this pivot away from the work you were doing before the supergrids and towards away from very lively optical effects in your pictures towards something very, very different. And that continued to evolve over the course of the rest of the decade when you created some of your most Spartan, but also I think most beautiful paintings in New York. But here you were about to leave London in the summer of 1975, if memory serves, working in the living room of your parents' home, doing this series, I think for the first time, of small works, or relatively small works on paper, but also doing things that advanced the notion of process, but it enabled you to do a very different kind of thing than you'd done before.
Yeah, and they were quite physical. So the illusion in the work, or the hedonistic pleasure in the paintings, or the exuberance in the paintings that preceded these, was expunged in favor of a kind of dark, brooding rigor. But of course you can see that I'm a reluctant minimalist because I'm a romantic, and these are nocturnal paintings. I mean, they are paintings on paper, really, where I pressed the tape in and ironed it down. A lot of them have the tape left in. So there's ridges in the work, and I burnish them and push the paint down. So they're very tough, but at the same time, mysterious in the color. The layering of the color belies a romantic spirit.
And how did you create the tone on the paper?
Well, I would put masking tape down, and I would use acrylic paint with a lot of medium and paint it on, let it dry, and then cut and take some of the tape out, and then put more layers on, and take some of the paint out, some of the tape off, cut it off, and put more layers on, so that you're not meant to follow the process, because you can't, and I can't either. When I look up now, I can't follow it in the sense that it's a plan. So they, as conceptual artworks, of course, they fail because they're not decodable.
No, and they combine a process with improvisation at the same time, yes?
Yeah, and mystery. You know, they have mystery in them.
So again, was this the first time you worked on a fairly small scale, particularly with works on paper? It's something you come back to from time to time.
Yeah, it was the first time, and what I also do love about them is that they're suspended on the paper. They look as if they're stamped on the paper because they're so physical and the edges are so hard, but there they are on a piece of paper.
So if you permit me a silly question, you were kind of making the process up as you went along.
Yeah, it wasn't meant to be followed. You know, if it was a paper trail, it's quite a crazy one. You can't follow it.
So again, there are only two of this wonderful series of 51 works in the show. I don't know whether you've ever shown them all together. I don't think you can. You sold some of them along the way, but you kept most of them, but have they been shown at one time?
They were.
Yeah.
And they were shown in Los Angeles. And when I showed them in Los Angeles, they were very admired. They weren't admired in the sense that people bought them, but lots of artists liked them, and many people came to see them. And I had a very, very nice relationship with Los Angeles, which I've always regretted not keeping up.
Well, you said once to me that At this point, you were still in London, but I think determined to leave and to come back to the United States and I think settle here. And you had to make a choice between Los Angeles and New York. At least that's
right.
the choice you had posed to yourself. You said, well, Los Angeles is appealing because, like London, it had embraced a kind of soft minimalism, a kind of more hedonistic one, I guess you might say. But you chose New York because it was...
It was phenomenological.
Yeah.
You know, the Los Angeles artists and the London artists had a lot in common. And there was a lot of Los Angeles artists being shown in London. And I was shown in Los Angeles. And they would have been extremely happy if I'd gone there. And they were unhappy that I was going to New York. But I thought of New York as more, more difficult. And I don't know, somehow more fascinating because it was more difficult. I'm not so sure I value that anymore. I think if I made the choice now, I'd go to LA.
So you picked up, you moved with the help of Harkness Fellowship to New York and settled in here. And over the next 5 years or so, you went on to make monochrome paintings, some monochrome drawings, increasingly austere, never entirely devoid of color, but not much color in them, and reducing them ultimately to the simplest of compositions, horizontal stripes of even proportions with.
Not only that,
and
the one at the top wasn't at the bottom.
there you go.
And the one at the bottom wasn't at the top.
Well, we can talk about one of those now, but I've chosen a picture here on the screen. Get it to work. Oops. Of a painting that was done right at the end of this time we're talking about, because the darker pictures really don't read well in reproduction. Hard to tell what's going on. This is a picture from 1980. So again, sort of coming to the end of this period. And will you sort of tell the audience where you got to in terms of making these pictures in their kind of simplest compositional formats? Because this is I think, a good example.
Well, what I did actually was make lots and lots of paintings where the surface was two surfaces, which is not entirely unrelated to the inset idea. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at two things at once. I'd paint the painting one color, put masking tape on the whole surface, and it would be 50-50, exactly 50-50, because they had to be very rigorous. So you're basically looking at two colors at once, and they'd make a hum, a visual hum. And of course, at the time there were a lot of serial musicians working, Steve Reich, for example, and a lot of performance artists who would just play one instrument, moving back and forth, destroying narrative. And I was more than happy making these paintings, I have to say. But my life was very austere because I was working a lot physically, making lofts, doing building work. Mm-hmm. And I think what I was doing in a certain sense was marking time, integrating myself. You know, my dad said to me, my dad was an Irishman in England after the Second World War. Oops. Because Ireland was neutral, but not really. Or as they would say, England's problem is Ireland's opportunity. So they basically weren't neutral. And my dad said to me, when in Rome, do as the Romans, which I think is a very good advice for immigrants. And I did this. I did as the Romans. I integrated myself into America in a way that I don't know of anybody else. Anybody else's people come over and they hold on to too much. And then they kind of get fired out of America. It's almost as an image, people being fired out of cannons back to Europe. Because they try to hold on to too much. Well, now, of course, New York has been conquered by Europe. But I'm talking about then, when the hegemony of New York was imperious. And I did as the Romans, and I integrated myself into America with these very austere, however, still, in a sense, romantic minimal paintings. Because even though they are very, very rigorous, they're still romantic because the delicate color from one side to the other has a poetry about it.
But at this time then, and this is after 5 years in New York, you began, as in this picture, to bring back color. And number two, you started using oil rather than acrylic. Sometimes the two together, right?
That really nearly gave me a nervous breakdown, I have to say. God almighty.
So teaching yourself how to handle oil paint.
Bloody things kept going wrong, one after the other. It was making me so crazy. And I started using oil paint. But of course, there was something in it that was interesting. Like New York itself, its difficulty fascinated me. So I persisted with the oil paint, which of course gradually yielded extraordinary results.
Well, this is an early example of that. Let's move on to this. This is another one. Catch up with things here. This is a picture from a year later, also in the exhibition called Blue, one I had never seen before until this evening. It's in one of the collections in Dublin. And it's an extraordinary picture for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is it's an oil painting that begins to look in some ways like an oil painting.
Oh, yeah.
If you look closely at it, the touch is coming back. The different colors that you use have different kinds of opacity or shine to them and the like. You're exploring all that, but you're also doing something entirely different in this picture, and that is moving away from a single image painting towards something else. How did you get here?
With a lot of grief. I mean, I have to say it was not easy to get from all over painting to relational painting. And there was very little encouragement from my ambience, because I was really knitted in to Lower Manhattan.
Right, you just been featured on the cover of Art Forum, and
Yeah,
you got a great article on you by Sam Hunter, if memory serves.
yeah,
And then you do this, and it's against the grain, yeah?
yeah. Shows my ingratitude. So, you see it in the other painting, the one before, where I put two things together. Well, that's like putting two figures together, because I used to take those measurements from my own hips. So I'd go like that, that would make the width of the canvas. So I wanted them to be body size. So when people looked at them, they felt that they were kind of like two figures. And I even gave one a title, Boris and Gleb, which are from a Byzantine painting. You know.
So when it comes to a picture like this, you've gone beyond the mirroring or the diptych
Yeah.
format to something that's different. It's assembled or pieced together. There are four fields, but four different pictorial fields, but three canvases too.
Yeah, this blue one at the top, the horizontal against the green, is not a physical division. And you can see the different ridges. And I think in this painting, the reason I dumped illusionism for surface is starting to yield results. It's starting to become clearly, emphatically obvious that the absence of body on the blue horizontals, the way I wipe the paint off, and the red, you can see the ridges in it. Then you start to get something happening with the surface, the body of it, or as you talked about earlier, the shape of it. What body does the idea inhabit? And this is what I was really after. And if I hadn't dumped the illusionistic paintings and paid the price for that, which was a significant amount of rejection, I never would have got to the other stuff, the surface of it, the body of it.
Well, let's see where that leads in a moment. But before we get there, I want to ask, and maybe I'm misremembering, in terms of the process of making a picture like Blue, you didn't necessarily start out by saying, I'm going to put 4 panels with these kinds of colors and stripes together. Did you, or did you make these things separately and essentially assemble the picture?
No, I was improvising all the way through. I was making it up as I was going along. I'd got, by this time, I'd got far away from any sense of a readable paper trail, which was de rigueur in minimalism. Like, this is the way this is made because this is the way it's made, which is basically a tautology. And, you know, what you see is what you get and all that business. I got far away from that, and basically far away from my compadres, my downtown Manhattan buddies. They were wondering what the hell I was doing at this point.
So the process really that put this together was improvised, right? And
completely.
okay. And where does that lead? So let's look at this next one, which is from the same year, surprisingly, I think, because it although it bears a a resemblance to blue. It's, well, let's use the political phrase, it's a great leap forward. And it really is something that you've always considered to be a pivotal moment in your work.
Well, then, to go from blue to this within months was a tremendous leap, and I didn't really know how that was going to turn out at all, or what the reception to it was going to be. But of course, here I broke the picture edge, and the difference between the way things are painted became more clear. Here it's emphatic, because some of them are painted quite carefully and others are painted very loose. But there's a kind of pounding, jazzy, punk, musical rhythm running all the way, throbbing through it, I would say, that's holding it together.
And just so everyone's clear, these are 12 separate canvases pieced together, all on the same plane, but varied in contour, or height rather, jostling each other, bumping into each other visually on the wall. And it, you know, when we spoke about this some years ago, you said you explicitly were trying at that point to push the question of how unharmonious or disharmonious a picture might be before you couldn't keep it together anymore.
Yeah, I suppose I stopped working on it when I just thought if I add one more thing, it just become endless. It won't have any shape at all.
So a kind of picture having an argument with itself about how far it can go before it falls off the edge.
Yeah, and I was thinking of. Did you notice my voice changed? Hello. Okay, so I was thinking of Picasso at that point. You know, I was always quite scared of Picasso.
So you're thinking of the three musicians.
Yeah, and other things. Because what I noticed about Picasso is that he made geometry violent. And that was very interesting to me. He made geometry expressionistic, but it was still geometry. Everything was geometricized. People's noses sticking out in the wrong direction and bodies distorted, but they were still geometry in some way. Or they were the renegade offspring of geometry. And that fascinated me. So I was inspired by that to try to make a painting that was still geometric but achieved some kind of overload. So it definitely has a relationship with backcloth, because I'm saying almost the same things. But I didn't do it with opticality. Here I've done it sculpturally and with an emphatically non-illusionistic surface that had a beat running through it. I thought of it also as a picture of Manhattan.
Yeah, Deborah Solomon once characterized it as a bunch of row houses jostling each other together in a sense. But I think it's important for the audience to, or for us to underscore that this is also a great leap in scale. It's 20 feet in size, 20 feet long. You had never made a picture of this size before.
No, and you know, I had no market for it, and I was only just able to afford to make it.
So in 1 year, 1981, you're making these new, very different kinds of pictures, right? And concluding with this one, which was featured in a show at PS1 in New York and captured a lot of attention. And I think fair to say that you and probably everyone else who saw it thought it was full of possibilities, certainly pointing in a new direction. And yet at that moment, you don't really explore this. You move on to something else, I think, very quickly. And that change is heralded by a residency you did at the Albee Foundation in Montauk in the summer of 1982, when you made a group of pictures, I think maybe about 18 or so, which small pictures, roughly made, of which this is an example, which come out of the work of 1981, but are very, very different in character. And you really characterized this work as a big change for you and a kind of discovery of a new direction. How would you describe that to the audience?
Well, they were small, and you all know who Edward Albee is, of course. But they don't really.
Moving along.
So, Edward Albee had a barn at the end of Long Island, Montauk. And he used to let artists work there. So I went out there and I basically worked with all the pieces of wood that were left around, and I stuck them together and turned them into little paintings. And this little painting, for example, was painted in 2 days. And quite literally, I painted the orange part one afternoon. And the sun came through the windows and it was on the back of my neck and it was making me quite hot. And I painted the painting quite hot. And then the next day, I came and I saw what in fact was a little orange painting with a step in it. I started to put steps in them. I'm not sure why I did that, but I did it. And there it was, just orange and red. A nice little horizontal painting. And the next day, when I went into the studio, it wasn't hot anymore. It was cold.
Yeah.
And I took another piece of wood and I stuck it on the bottom of it. And then I painted over the orange and red with the colors that I'd remembered seeing on the beach. So they started to get kind of beachy. You know, like there's a lot of bones on beaches. Mm-hmm. And this color, this bone color, started coming into my work big time. So I started to think of them in a way as kind of suprematist, minimalist, knockabout landscapes in a funny way. I mean, that's almost like a little diary of how the weather was when I was making it.
And the temperature in the studio, too.
And the temperature in the studio was much cooler the following day. So I made it cool. But you can see the orange is under the color there at the top. And then I named it after an island out there called Ridge.
As many of
because it had ridge in it.
Yeah, as many of the pictures are from that summer. So this, you're working on Heart of Darkness, which is in the exhibition the same summer in Manhattan, and that's influenced, the resolution of that picture is influenced by your work out in Montauk. And then you go on over the next several years and you create an extraordinary group of pictures that take the ideas you explored or invented for yourself in Montauk and brought them to a big, big scale. This introduces the exhibition upstairs. It's a work in our collection in Philadelphia, nearly 11 feet tall. So again, you scaled up completely, and you took this idea also of working with different panels, but also canvases with stretchers of different depths too. The paintings at this point become very different physically than they ever had before.
Yeah, well, a couple of things happened. I built my own loft. Besides building other people's lofts, I also built my own loft. And the loft that I took on Duane Street, where I basically made my career, and if it had not been for my friend, who's unfortunately not with us, a guy called Sol Schwimmer, who negotiated me a very favorable lease, I doubt I would have been able to make these paintings, because I got the space that I needed for the money that I didn't have. And I used to work at Princeton, and I'd give my check to my landlord on the way in, plus $7 every month. And then other days I was still working on construction, making these paintings. But the loft was a textile warehouse, and they were beautiful shelves, all running all the way through it. It was already an artwork. And I took all those boards, and I took all the shelves, the structure, and I built all the walls out of them. And that was an extreme case of recycling. And then I started turning the boards and making these deep stretches. So it came out of work and life. And in fact, a couple of those paintings, I just used the boards and painted straight on them. You know, I mean, they were literal stripes, like floorboards. So this, by the time I got to these, you know, I was exploding what I was doing on Montauk. But there's one other very crucial point. The issue of metaphor and figuration became paramount in the work. And that's how I was able to offer something that was a very viable, workable, rich alternative to the emptiness of minimalism. I was making figurative, abstract paintings.
You actually described them to an interviewer at that time as related to each other, these pictures from this period, but different. And physical events, each and every one of them, just like people, and just as people are different, ugly, beautiful, what have you, aggressive. These canvases took, or these paintings took on those kinds of different characteristics as well.
Yeah, and this one is obviously an homage to Camus. It's called The Fall, and you have this sense that there's a figure, something, falling. Then you've got the rising columns pushing back up, and the painting also looks top heavy. So there's a lot of stress in it. You know, I'm really making a picture of a possible fall.
You know, these pictures of any you've made throughout your career are the most heavily painted, or thickly painted. The paint actually has a kind of palpable physical presence to it that's unusual, certainly compared to what you were doing 2 years before this. And they're deliberately rough-hewn in a sense too, right?
Yeah, they're really extremely physical. Because I was trying to assert the emotive, body-rich potential of painting in the face of a lot of other stuff. Also, I must say, in the face of the general refinement of American art, which, as I said before, is much less physical than European art. And I was trying to impose the urgency of abstraction and its emphatic possibility onto the culture.
So moving on, I'm going to ask Marla how long we should go on before you're going to give us the hook.
Up to you, really.
Well, everyone.
Take questions, or
Let me just go through a couple of more pictures with him, and then if you'd like to have some questions from the audience, that would be great, if you don't mind, Sean. So let's move on to a picture that you have here that I think is really quite extraordinary. In fact, I'd like to take it home with me, because it's such a wonderful work. We talk about much the same things as we have been talking, but I'd like to use this as a means of asking a question about paintings having arguments with themselves, and in the insertion of a kind of one pictorial system in the midst of another, and particularly using insets, which we talked about before in this early work. But in the late 80s, you began quite literally to put or insert canvases into bigger canvases like here. And what did that allow you to do?
Well, that allowed me to make all kinds of associations with the whole history of paintings with windows, paintings with views, and to make characters with different personalities but made out of the same general material. You know, I'm not making, for example, an inset with daisies painted on it, because it wouldn't make any relationship with that. Because this also allows me to do near and far, but all on a flat surface. The red painting, the red and white part of the painting, is a big, proud, beautiful field. Or as a very nice woman, curator, said to me when she saw this painting, it looks like a beautiful woman in a red dress. What she was saying was, it looks like a perfect thing. but in it is a window set awkwardly into the painting, into the field, disturbing one of the stripes, that's full of doubt. And another friend of mine said it looks like a picture of America. He's an architect friend of mine, and he said it looks like, again, the perfect field, but with this doubt in it, with a window of doubt in it, that's critiquing the big, bold, bright field. Of course, it's again an homage to a great writer, Nabokov, who is an immigrant in America. I mean, not like all the other Americans who are second generation, third generation immigrants, but a first generation immigrant. And he feels his oddness. So you can also sense that it's a figure in the ground. So this allowed me to do an enormous number of things visually and philosophically with the paintings.
You know, you said to me once that, and I don't know whether I'm going to remember this correctly, that figurative painters tend to work away from the subject.
Yeah, right.
The title. And then abstract painters, or in your practice, tend to work towards the subject, in this case, the title, the feeling of Nabokov's novel, very curious novel indeed. So how did that lead you to choose the colors you did for the big field and for the interloper, the colors that create doubt or what have you? And how did that lead you to fashion the surface of the picture, which is kind of implacable, mural? It's a really unusual picture amongst the ones of this time.
Well, I responded to the way I was thinking about it. And of course, I'm thinking about things all the time. And I mean, I'm quite a philosophically inclined person. And so when I'm working on a painting like that, I'm thinking about the field and the air in it and the grandeur of it, the confidence of it. Red and white, you know, everybody likes red and white. And then I start to make the window, instead of the window being a view, I'm actually filling in the view and using the colors of dirt or earth. It becomes heavy and earth-bound.
Does this process take into account also the choices you make in terms of the ground color of the paintings? Because in all of these pictures, particularly from the late 80s onwards, and certainly right through the Wall of Light series, the ground is such an important part of the experience of the picture.
Yeah, that's another thing we haven't really touched on. That comes more into focus with the Wall of Light paintings, where I start to let the underpainting play a very aggressive part in the result. So again, it's subversive.
We're going to go ahead right to one of those, although it's not properly a Wall of Light picture.
There's
This
yeah,
one.
That one will do. So, you know, there you've got the history of the painting in the drawing. So the ground color is subverting what's on top or informing what's on top. So you're looking at, let's say, a red bar that was a pink bar. So it's not really a red bar in the sense that it never had another history. So there's all that kind of stuff in the painting. evolution of the painting and the stratas of the painting, the layers of it coming forward, inform this history. And the history is allowed to describe edges. Now, again, and we haven't talked about edges yet, but edges are so important to me because edges are what make the world and all its problems. They're all made by edges. And I try to make edges that are, in a sense, taking this on board. All the possibilities and difficulties of edges, the way things come together, which are becoming more prescient.
You know, we could spend, but we won't, another hour talking about Wall of Light and the series related to that, to the Dorics, and then, of course, on to the landlines. But I want to end with this in the next picture and just ask you to speak about the, again, I think this has to do with, you know, the way you've come to use oil paint and understood its possibilities. But the pictures that we were looking at just a few minutes ago of the early 80s are implacable. Sometimes they eat up light. Sometimes they seem to reject it. They really have a kind of mural quality. The Wall of Light series, by contrast, light inhabits those pictures in a very kind of different and wonderful way. It's in this picture, which is not a Wall of Light picture, but related to it. And it's true as well of what you've been able to do with your remarkable prints, mostly aqua tints, not all of them, that you've been making, particularly over the last 2 decades. And I'd like you to, if you could talk a bit about printmaking and particularly this kind of printmaking and how it suits your purposes. And then we can end a bit about this notion of paintings as the bearers of kind of light in a sense, right?
Well, you know that I was a printer. When I left school, I went to work in a factory, print factory, and I was a typesetter. So it's in me. And I can read backwards. Because when you're a printer, you have to be able to read the type in the metal. Well, not anymore, because we were conquered by the computer. But I was a monotype typesetter. And I was the last gasp of monotype typesetting. And I'm used to all this transference and stripping of color. So what I do in these prints automatically is I allow the color or the ink and the paper to make the maximum from the few things that I do. Now, you can only do that if you're a printer, and I am a printer. So all these artists that galleries come to, you know, and say, would you like to make prints for what they euphemistically call young collectors? Mm-hmm. That's people without lots of money. They say, would you like to make some prints? So basically they try to make versions of paintings, but that's not printing.
No.
Because when you make a print like the one we're looking at, I use 3 colors to make that. And I get those 3 colors to do all kinds of stuff. And if you print in different orders, you get a different print. Because every time you print, you strip off some color. So I don't really know how to explain it, because you'd have to work in a print factory to be able to do it, you know. I just know how to do it. I mean, that's all I can say about it. I put the shapes down, and I use aquatint, and I use spit bite. Now, spit bite is when you see that one that's sticking up there. That is me etching with the brush. So I pass the brush over on 1, 2, 3 of them, and I pass the brush over with the acid 6 times on top of what is in fact resin rain, leaving some metal between it, like a half tone. And it etches. So you're etching directly with the brush. And then I play that off against some other edges where I've painted around it with hard ground and put it in a bath and etched it. And then I play with the way that the order in which they're printed. And the paper gives me the other color. See, I didn't make a color on that paper. That's the staining or the bleeding of the effect of the plate that's been wiped, you know, because you have to wipe the yellow off. But then you can wipe it somewhat casually, and then some of that yellow that's mostly there will be on the rest of the plate, and it will stain the paper, which makes this incredible light. So you're basically releasing light that is, according to your belief, embedded somehow in the paper.
It is. It's like magic.
That's what it is. It's a magic trick.
So however you get the transparencies, the tone,
Yeah.
and the texture.
And I can't tell people how to do it, because it's a bit like, I think it's a bit like being a sailor. You know, you just know. You know how to do things. And I know how to do things on the etching plate.
Oh, you do, and I think your prints are a real gift to the world. So thank you. Thank you. So I think we'll need to end our conversation if we want to have time to take a few questions from the audience. We'll be happy to try to answer them. Up there?
Yes, absolutely. This is my name's David, and I follow the theory that modern art should express a question or a theme. So I think that there are parts of modern art that have figures or objects that express questions like racism, consumerism, and discrimination. And you have the other part of modern art that just expresses fashion and color. So I ask you, what's the theme of your fashion colors when you paint? What are you trying to express?
In my paintings, I deal with relationships. And with the inset paintings in particular, I deal with things in and out of context, which has a vaguely political element to it. One person wrote on my work and said my paintings were very much connected to the theme of competition, or the competition of things one against the other. And as I already said, I deal with the issue of edges. And edges are profoundly important in the world. So in that sense, my paintings are philosophically political. The color in my work, I can't really explain. And I doubt if Andy Warhol would be able to explain all the colors in his work either.
Another question? Oh, you have really remembered it.
My name's Nicole. My question is, as somebody who also deals with a love-hate relationship with oil in the world, how long do you think it took you to get to that place of comfort and finally, like, the work was coming through in the relationship?
2 years.
Well, there you have it.
My name is Sarah. Along those ideas of comfort, I was looking at work where you started to work on that. How does that feel about changing from the white brown to one surface to another?
Well, I was thinking about metal in relation to oil painting, because there's a lot of history attached to oil painting. And I thought it was very interesting to make oil paintings on the material that we fly around in, that's entirely non-responsive. So, of course, my paintings are romantic. I mean, that's obvious. I'm a romantic spirit. But I do think that the juxtaposition of the emotional or the mysterious with the metal is very interesting. One seems to discipline the other or inform the other. Anyway, it's certainly dialectical. But you get a very aggressive response from metal. And the sound of it is aggressive. And canvas has an incredible long history. So you're part of that. You're joining that long history. So you're making surfaces that can't be easily decoded on a material that is simultaneously advantaged and burdened by its relationship to tradition. But with the metal, some other thing happens. And some of the inset paintings I've made with these sliced out metal panels are extremely interesting to me.
This one's on the screen right now.
Now that's a Doric painting. And the Doric paintings were all made on a proportion of 2 to 3. and the sections are 3:1. So they are deeply embedded in the idea of classicism. And I called them Doric because I wanted them to be, in a sense, a love letter to Greece, which I believe is the cradle of democracy. So I made them to the proportion of the floor of a Greek temple, which is usually 2:3. And I made a very simple drawing, and I countered that with this kind of simple yet poetic color. So the color was basically 3 colors. But I wanted to release a kind of poetic order, because I was thinking about the way that a temple allowed a certain freedom. It gave a classical structure that allowed a humanitarian or humanistic dialogue to take place within that structure. So I was attempting in these paintings to echo something like that. And I made about 20 of them.
All aluminum, right?
All on aluminum, all divided into 3, all the same proportion. So they are a huge series, which I'm going to show, by the way, in Poland in a big space. I'm going to show, well, 12 of them.
All right. One last question?
I suppose we are introducing ourselves. My name is Bryce. So you mentioned about the Underground and Nico being an album that you drew influence from or that was impactful to your work, as well as Phil Spector. I was wondering, kind of as music evolved through the 70s and 80s, what are some parallels you saw maybe in music that you, what am I trying to say? What other bands through the years kind of impacted how you saw your art and produced it?
Well, I've always been very close to music. And I was involved in music when I was in London for a short while. But I wanted to make something deeper, which I believe painting does. I'm not saying I'm right, I'm saying I believe painting does. Although I play music all the time in the studio, I'm very, very attached to it. When I was making that painting, backs and fronts, I made it at the time, as I explained earlier, when there was a lot of serialized music going on. You know, Steve Reich was a relentlessly programmatic kind of drummer. And of course, Philip Glass. But down in CBGB's, there were a lot of bands playing. One of them, a wonderful band, was Wire. And in front of one of my wall paintings, there was a performance of 2 guitarists. And one of them was called Chatham, who's still around. And the other one, his partner, was called Nina Canal. And she was a British girl who took her name from Canal Street. And they played these 2 electric guitars in front of my painting. And my painting was doing this. one set of stripes on top of another, and my painting was going bang, 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 like this. And they were playing these electric guitars in front of it. And it was fantastic. And the whole punk CBGB movement was around at that time, you know, and we were very involved in it. And of course, that had a relationship with for me anyway, very much with my striped paintings. Because in a sense, I saw them as guitar strings. But they were quite sonic. So in the 70s, certainly, between that area where I was making the minimal paintings and the other paintings that were breaking with minimalism, the relationship between those paintings and the development of contemporary music was tremendous.
And that was a New York phenomenon, too.
It was. CBGB's was fantastic.
Thank you. On that happy note, we have to call it a night. Thank you. And thank you for coming this evening. It's great to have you. I realized that I'd lost my microphone halfway through. Thank you.